Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a lioness in pastels. Now from the photo in the corner of my finished drawing you can see that I've added a savanna background. Now I like to add my backgrounds first before my subject because they are further away and behind that subject itself, so it makes sense to me to draw that in first. Now if you would like to watch the background portion of this project, then that's available on my Patreon channel now. I'll link that all in the description below if it's of interest. Now for this project, the first thing I did was actually work on the background. Now I will have a video here on YouTube showing how I did that, but if you would like to watch that real-time tutorial, it is available on my Patreon channel now. I'll link all of that in the description below if it's of interest. Now for that background I used my PanPastels. There were no pencils there at all. And as you can see here, I've used PanPastels for my base layer for the fur. Now I've had a couple of questions about how to use PanPastels, and this project on Patreon really does focus on that thoroughly. Now one question that I'm asked is how much PanPastel should be applied for the base layer when working on the fur. Now this is a great question, and there's one simple way to make that easier, and it's that ideally you should be able to see your transfer lines through that PanPastel base layer. This will ensure that you don't end up filling the tooth of the paper too soon, and as you can see here I start to now work with my pastel pencils and they go onto that paper beautifully. If you start working with your pencils and they feel like they're gliding over the surface and the pigment isn't showing up, that's an indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now because PanPastel pigment is very soft, it's easier to fill the tooth of the paper, so how much that's applied to that first layer is crucial because that's going to influence what we can do going forward. Now this is a 12 by 16 size portrait, so it's not really small, but because I decided to draw the entire lioness, this does mean that her face in relation to the size of the portrait is quite small. So therefore I'm going to have to focus on my pencil technique and the layers to get that depth within the fur, rather than adding in loads of individual details. Now this fur is highly detailed, I can't stress that enough, but it's the values and the way that those pencils are layered which helps to build up the depth here. So the ear is a prime example of where I've got that centre nice and dark, and I can now start to build up those mid-tones and lighter layers on top. Now the wonderful thing about working with pastels is they are very flexible, so we can layer from dark to light, or we can be a bit more cautious and work light to dark, which you're going to see throughout this project as we work more on the body. But if I don't get the values right here and the contrast isn't sharp, I'm not going to end up with that three-dimensional realistic look that I'm going for. So if you are creating any of your drawings, it doesn't matter the medium, it could be a painting, and you feel like it's a little flat, it doesn't quite have that wow factor about it, it's usually because the contrast and the values are lacking. So if you go back in and darken up your shadows and brighten up your highlights, you'll find that that will have more of that three-dimensional look to the piece. Now when I work with this base layer here, look at how smooth and soft the transitions are. Now transitions is something that I speak about in all of my Patreon tutorials because I feel that this is really going to help to build up depth, softness, and again realism in the fur. I don't want any harsh start and stop points because that's going to show through in my additional layers that I'm adding with my pencils. In order for me to create this softer looking fur, it's shorter, so my pencil technique is important, but if I have that harsh base layer that I'm working from, those pencil strokes are also going to look harsh. So I really do focus this first base layer, getting that nice smooth transition. Now as I continue to work on the nose and the muzzle area, you can really see how I'm focusing on very small sections. This is something that I do with any portrait, but when I've got something that's as complex as this with all of the different elements, working on small sections, one section at a time, can really help to break that process up. Now this for me is one way that I stay motivated because I don't personally like working in whole individual layers because it ends up staying more at that ugly stage for too long, and I find that a little disheartening. So if I can get an area about 80% complete so it looks like that reference photo, I can then move on to the next part of that subject, and then before I know it, it already looks like that animal. So it's something that I do find helps massively from our mental state in terms of how we progress through that piece. It's very easy to get overwhelmed and stressed, so it's one thing that could be really beneficial. and it's usually caused by working on something that's too big. So if that area is, for instance, the whole body, and I'm trying to block that in with one solid layer, then I work with my next layer and so on. It can be one of those things that we feel like we're not getting anywhere fast. Whereas after this drawing session, I ended it after working on the face, and I knew there that it was already looking like this lioness. I felt motivated to come back and start working on her body. The body here is a larger area, so that can be daunting, but the fact that I've got the face looking realistic, that's now one step closer to me knowing that this is going to look good when it's finished. Now, I've already mentioned earlier in the video about how we can work with light to dark techniques. Pastels are so forgiving that there are many different ways to get to the same end. But what I'm doing here is I'm starting with a lighter base, and then I'm adding in my darker midtones and then building up that softness that I've mentioned earlier. Now, it's very easy once you work with your PanPastel base layer to want to jump into your details. Now, the problem with doing that is you're going to end up with something that looks more grainy, and it's something that I personally don't like in my portrait. So I like to work with multiple layers and building up that depth gradually. Now, one question that I'm asked frequently, almost every day, is how do the details in my drawings look smooth without that grainy, gritty appearance? Now, this is all in the layering process, but also how you use the pencils. So my real-time tutorials on Patreon focus on that from start to finish. So if you would like to see that, if that's something that you're noticing in your own work, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. Now, I have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll also link that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I talk about 3 main things relating to pencil technique. That's fur length, fur thickness, and fur direction. Now, as I continue to work with my pencils here, starting to map in that first layer of detail, I'm really focusing on the way that I need to move the pencil. So the fur direction, it's not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if I start to move that pencil in a way that's not accurate to that reference photo, I will then change the proportions of the body or whatever element I'm working on. Now, of course, that would be a real problem because it would start to maybe potentially look like the animal has lumps where it shouldn't be, the shoulder, the legs might start to look a little deformed. So that is something that I do focus on as soon as I use my pencils. Now, the fur length is, of course, determined by how long that pencil is in contact with the paper. Now, the fur here on the neck, it is longer than that on the face, so I have to be making sure that my pencil strokes are in contact with that paper for a split second longer. But it is such a short amount of time because this fur is very short compared to a breed like a German Shepherd or a Newfoundland. Obviously, it's going to vary dramatically from one animal to the next. Now, lastly, the fur thickness. This is determined really by a couple of different factors. You've got how sharp or how blunt the pencil should be, depending on the texture that we're trying to create. How we hold and move that pencil is a very big deal in terms of the type of pencil stroke that's created, and also the amount of pressure that's applied to the pencil. So these 3 things need to be taken into account depending on the animal that we're drawing. Now, like with anything with art, there are no rules, so even one lioness to the other may have slightly different textures in the fur. The chest fur might be a little bit longer, the fur on the face might appear a little bit fluffier, so they will require us to use our pencils in a different way to replicate that in our drawing. But what's important is to look at that reference photo and study that before we put that pencil in contact with the paper. So I'll look at my reference photo and I'll know where I need to move that pencil, where that fur is directed, and how that's going to help to influence the structure of that animal in my portrait. Now, as I'm working on building up more of this chest area, look at how I'm now focusing on the values and how soft those values are. There are no harsh pencil strokes here, and that's really important for building up that shorter but softer fur texture. Now, as all of this does vary from one animal to the next, my Patreon channel really does focus on a range of wildlife subjects and also domestic pets. So if any of my Patreon members are looking to maybe take on pet portrait commissions of their own, there's a wide variety of pet subjects there, different fur textures and colours, so that they can then implement the tips and techniques I share into their own work. So just for the next few moments of this tutorial, I end up focusing on how to create those smoother looking details and what causes it. So if you start jumping into those details on top of the pan pastel base layer, as I've mentioned a few moments ago, you are going to get those grainier looking lines, and here is what I'm demonstrating. So this is something that I wanted to really focus this tutorial on, because it's one of the things that can cause a lot of frustration. When I first used pastels, I nearly gave up the medium straight away because I didn't like that grainy look that they can have. But it's all about the layering process. They don't have to have that appearance. Even though we use textured paper when working with pastels, that textured paper is there for a reason, to enable us to layer endlessly if we need to. Now that leads me on to the paper that I like to use. So this was drawn on Clairefontaine Pastelmat paper, and it is by far my favourite. It does allow for those various number of layers that we need when drawing realistic fur. But I do have a tutorial here on YouTube where I'm using the Clairefontaine paint on paper, and that there I was actually quite pleased and surprised with the results that I got. So if you would like to see how that paper works with pastels, then I'll link that tutorial in the description below. Now going back to the legs of this lioness, the one most important thing here is that I had to shorten my pencil strokes. Now this would be the case with pretty much any shorter coated animal. Of course you've got exceptions like Newfoundlands where they've got long coats all over, but for something like this I do want to be shortening my pencil strokes to make sure that the legs don't look as fluffy as the chest area. So that's something that I want to be focusing on right from the beginning of those detailed layers. Now as always, I'm also focusing on the values. So here I've got that lovely lighter highlight on the right hand side of the leg, and it gradually rolls over to the left side where it starts to get a little darker. Now this is what helps to build up that three-dimensional shape and that curve to the leg. If I don't get that right, or again I have those harsh start and stop points, I end up creating that two-dimensional look, something more of like a step, so you want to avoid that. You want to have the softness of transitions and the softness of those values, but making sure you've got a range of those values. So a nice selection of highlights and then those darker tones as well. Now I've spoken a lot about the values and what's required to build up that contrast, but the actual light source of a reference photo is something that should be captured in that drawing. So for instance, if you take the leg that I've just drawn on the left, that is actually stepped slightly closer to the camera, so one step in front compared to the leg that I'm drawing on now. So it's really important to get the range of values with those highlights and shadows correct to make it look like the light source is catching one of those legs a little brighter and therefore casting a shadow on something next to it. Now one tip with that is, just because you're working on a highlight or a lighter section of that reference photo doesn't mean that you should always use white. So here I'm using a lot of my cream and pink colours to build up those highlights first. I don't jump into my lightest pencils initially, and that is something that will add so much more depth to your drawings. And when working on areas of a portrait that are a little bit more challenging, like feet and toes, I find that sometimes they can look very deformed quite quickly. Just by focusing on the lights and the darks can really help to make them realistic right from the beginning. So this again is something that I do focus the real-time version on. Look at here how I'm mapping in the dark sections where I'm separating each toe, and then I start to put in those highlights, those midtones and shadows. But because I've isolated those darker portions first, I haven't just blocked in the entire foot. I know exactly where each toe should be. That makes this complex element far easier to tackle. So this back leg of the lioness was slightly out of focus, so I'm using all of the same techniques with building up my layers and my values, but I'm now working on creating some thicker pencil strokes to give the impression of less detail. So if I get everything nice and soft here by making sure that I don't use those fine intricate pencil techniques, then that's going to look out of focus. It's one thing that's really important. You don't want to be using a really sharp pencil when you've got an element that's out of focus, because again that's going to end up pulling details into that section. Now the very last element to go into this was the branch that the lioness was stood on. So I wanted to be making sure again that I followed the light source, and I wanted to get the shadows right for what would be casting from her body onto the branches. So here the lighting and how that is really bouncing off of the texture of the bark is important for getting that realistic look into this element. So how I'm moving my pencil strokes here, this has to be different to what I'm creating with the fur, because obviously I don't want this to look like it's got hair, but I do want to be using the same techniques in terms of the length of the pencil strokes, the thickness and the way that they're directed. So all of this at the moment for the top section was going in more of a diagonal angle, but as I worked on this section in the corner where the branch of that tree has been cut, that there created a very different look. So I wanted to be making sure that I got the grain of the wood here, those bumps, the impression of that texture in my drawing. Now in order to do that, it's all of the same principles that we used when working on the fur. I had to focus on my values and the lots of layers that went into that. You can see here that I'm really mapping in those darker tones, and then I start to put in some of my midtones. What I want to be doing, just like with the fur, is saving those brighter highlights for my last layers. They are still what's going to be catching those very top surfaces of the branches, so that's going to help to make that look realistic if you leave those to those last layers. Now of course for this area here I have started off with my lighter colours, but I'm going to be darkening them up in stages, and I ended up darkening this section up more than in the original reference photo. Because it was where the foot was perched on the very edge of this section of branch, I felt that it was a little distracting. So I just come in here, darkening that up, and then I pulled my highlights back over the top. Now this could also be a section where it was quite overwhelming, so you'll notice that I've split this up into 3 or 4 sections of that branch. I haven't blocked it all in at the same time. But again, just like when I worked on the fur, my base layer is smooth and soft blended look with those PanPastels first. Even though this bark has texture, I've still not wanted to have any harsh start and stop points. Now one big tip, when you are drawing an animal that is stood on something, you do want to be making sure that you've got a shadow of some kind under the feet. So the foot in the middle, so what would be her right front foot as we're looking at this drawing, there you can see quite a dark shadow on the branch. Now that's because those toes are perched over that area of the branch and therefore cast in more of a shadow. So it's going to be very important here to study that reference photo. The lighting and those tiny little shadows, those highlights, this is what's going to make that art go to the next level. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this or any of my other real-time tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. And if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.